South Africa has just recorded its lowest average inflation rate in more than 2 decades, and almost nobody can feel it because, hey, when a takeaway coffee costs you $50, the idea that price pressures are easing doesn't feel like honest news. It feels disconnected from daily life. So here's the simple part that most people don't get told. Inflation doesn't measure whether things are cheap. It measures the rate at which prices are increasing. And so when inflation comes down, it doesn't mean that prices fall with it. It just means that they're rising more slowly than before. So in 2025, the rate averaged 3.2%, the lowest since 2004. I mean, even the latest reading, 3.6% in December, is still considered low. And so in plain terms, prices overall are no longer accelerating the way that they were a few years ago. But that doesn't mean that prices across the board are behaving the same. Many everyday costs rose sharply in previous years and then just stayed there. Others, though, are still increasing faster than the average. Meanwhile, prices in some categories actually moved in the opposite direction. So inflation smooths all of that into a single number. And households, though, are experiencing the expensive stuff repeatedly. And so that's why the headline and the lived reality can both be true at the same time. And this is where it starts to matter because inflation is what determines interest rates. So simply put, if inflation stays low and predictable, the Reserve Bank gets room to cut interest rates later this year, which would ease pressure on everything from your loans and your bonds to your debt repayments. And if it doesn't, rates stay higher for longer. And so while everyday prices explain the disconnect that people are feeling, the inflation number explains what may happen next. And right now, those two things are moving on very different timelines. So that's where the economy sits right now. Low on paper, expensive in practice. But the irony doesn't stop there. Every now and then, something comes across the timeline that just feels so ironic that you have to blink twice. As we know, the National Lottery has never been without its critics, as the single largest government tender in the country, valued at roughly 180 billion rand over its license period. It has spent years wrapped up in court cases, governance battles, and recurring allegations of corruption and mismanagement. And so when something that big exists, controversy tends to orbit it permanently. So that's why these ethics advisors were brought in at all to help restore credibility and guide the lottery back onto the straight and narrow. But in a twist that almost writes itself, investigators now said that parts of the money paid to those ethics advisors should be clawed back after finding that the firm charged management fees that it wasn't entitled to, over-invoiced for its services, and kept the difference on payments that it was supposed to pass on in full. In other words, the people hired to advise on ethical conduct are now themselves facing questions about it. It's almost too perfectly ironic, the watchdog ending up in the doghouse. And so there we have it. In a system this large and this contested, even the cleanup crews don't always stay clean. So while that unravels slowly, investors moved much faster on something else. Mr. Price is one of South Africa's most familiar retail names, but last month's announcement, a nearly 10 billion rand deal to buy European discount store NKD, triggered one of the sharpest investor reactions the group has ever seen. The share price plummeted hard, wiping billions off its market value within a couple of hours. And for some shareholders, that wasn't the end of it. So at the center of this backlash is what Mr. Price is paying and taking on. The group is buying NKD, a chain that most of us have never heard of, at 37 times earnings, while loading several billions in debt onto its balance sheet that's being debt-free. It also marks a decisive push into Europe at a time when several South African retailers are actually retreating from offshore bets after years of costly mistakes. Now, the context matters because this dispute has somewhat now shifted from price to process. You see, some shareholders argue that Mr. Price's recent run of acquisitions amounts to a big strategic shift, one requiring explicit shareholder approval under JSE rules. Now, management insists that this is a standalone deal within its authority. But what's now also driving this tension is also confidence. This is no longer about whether or not NKD succeeds. It's whether shareholders can trust how management makes these big, irreversible decisions. And before we cruise on to our bagel bite of the day, here's a couple of the headlines worth knowing. For starters, after severe flooding in Limpopo and in Mpumalanga, Flysafair has suspended all flights to Hoedspruit Eastgate Airport until at least the 14th of February, even as other airlines gradually resume operations. Nedbank has announced a 14 billion rand deal to buy a controlling stake in Kenya's NCBA group, targeting access to more than 60 million customers as it accelerates its push into East Africa. And nearly 600,000 South African workers have been affected after employers deducted pension and benefit contributions from salaries but failed to pay them into funds, leaving over 7 billion rand unpaid and triggering renewed enforcement by regulators. And on to our Bagel Bite of the day. But first, my friends, if you are enjoying the show, put a smile on my dial and hit that like and subscribe button and share this with your friends. Stop keeping us to yourself. And now, with that out the way, let's see what you got. The question is, which mammal has the longest lifespan? Is it A, the Indian elephant, B, the bowhead whale, or C, the blue whale? We'll give you all the answer at the end of the show. What is the highest point in South Africa? Most people assume it's something obvious and pointy, but it isn't. The highest point in the country is Mafadi, sitting at about 3,450 meters above sea level in the Drakensberg along the border with Lesotho. But you see, Mafadi doesn't rise like Mount Kilimanjaro or dominate a skyline like Mount Everest. It's part of a broad rolling escarpment, not some enticing summit. Now, the good news is that you can hike it. Most routes take 3 to 5 days across the Drakensberg mountain range, often starting from Injisuti or Cathedral Peak. The terrain flattens out near the top, landmarks disappear, and there's not often this obvious summit moment. And so that's why many hikers stand on South Africa's highest point without realizing it. And so the challenge isn't necessarily the climb, it's the distance, the altitude, and the navigation. Now, trail runners have done the whole route, start to finish, in under 6 hours. But for most mortals like myself, it's going to take about 5 days to finish and an additional 5 weeks to recover. Either way, to spend a moment in your life standing at the highest point in your own country, I mean, why not take the opportunity to do that? And as for that Bagel Bite, it's the bowhead whale. Some have been reliably dated at over 200 years old thanks to old harpoon tips still lodged in their blubber, which means a few bowheads swimming around today were alive when Napoleon was still a problem. And my friends, that's it for today's show, and that is it for the work week. Thanks so much for tuning in until the very end. Hope you guys have a cracker Friday, a rejuvenating weekend, and we'll catch you all on Sunday evening for the next round of the good stuff. God bless.